Buenos dias, boa tarde, bonsoir. It's a beautiful, beautiful day. My name is Erica Ashton, and I am the Festival Director for the Black Consciousness Festival. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this special event at the Black Consciousness Festival 2021, celebrating the 25th anniversary of the publication of Salt, a significant piece of writing from Mr. Earl Lovelace, one of our living legends within the African diaspora. I am reaching in to you from the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. We remember the indigenous peoples who first inhabited these lands. Among them, the Taino, Wawar, Kalinago, Lokomo, and so many others. We give thanks for them. We give thanks for all that they are. We give thanks for their presence, their stewardship of these lands, their knowledge, their ways of doing and being. Yesterday, we stood with Brazil as they commemorated Black Consciousness Day. We remember Zumbi and all of our other ancestors who resisted in so many ways so that we can be here today. We give thanks for the contributions they made to building our spaces. We give thanks for those who are walking with us on this journey, our Orishas, spirit guides, animal guides, our elders, and we give thanks for those who are coming after us. Today we see and we celebrate Mr. Earl Lovelace. We give thanks for his life, his lineage, his contribution in the space, his writings, his thoughts, his works. A giant, a griot who is with us. Let me tell you a little bit about Mr. Lovelace. He was born in a small village in Trinidad. His early work was in agriculture and as a forest ranger. He has been a journalist. He taught at a number of American universities and was a writing resident at the University of the West Indies. He continues to write, to think, and to engage with us. His works include While Gods Are Falling, 1965, The Schoolmaster, 1968, The Dragon Can't Dance, 1979, The Wine of Astonishment, 1982, Justina's Calypso and Other Plays, 1984, A Brief Conversion and Other Stories, 1988, Salt, 1996, and It's Just a Movie, 2012. When Mr. Lovelace's first novel, While Gods Are Falling, was published in 1965, C.L.R. James, another of our giants in the African diaspora, in the Journal of Commonwealth Literature of July 1969, hailed him as a new type of writer, a new type of prose, a different type of work. Bernardine Evaristo, in a review of another of Mr. Lovelace's novels, noted that, and I quote, Lovelace is unusual among celebrated Caribbean writers in that he has always lived in Trinidad. Most writers leave to find support for their literary endeavors elsewhere, and this, arguably, shapes the literature, especially after long periods of exile. But Lovelace's fiction is deeply embedded in Trinidadian society and is written from the perspective of one whose ties to his homeland have never been broken, unquote. We see this gift for us, a shift, where we can appreciate ourselves and the unbroken ties we can have to our homeland. Thank you for this, Mr. Lovelace. And now a little bit about Salt. Salt was published in 1996 and won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize in 1997 and was shortlisted for the 1998 International Dublin Literary Award. It has been and continues to be utilized in so many different spaces. Conversations around who we are, about reparations, as a teaching tool, a cultural reference, a mirror for all of us. And we will get some insights from our sharing today on its reach and its impact. Mr. Lovelace, thank you for giving us salt. And to all of you, thank you for joining with us in this celebration. This celebration of the 25th anniversary of the publication of SALT. To start off this celebration, we have a feature address from Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. Thank you, Professor.
What a tremendous honor it is to speak within the context of the Caribbean Reparatory Justice Movement. The historical context within which we have witnessed the evolution of a movement demanding reparations for the crimes committed against humanity in the context of the chattel enslavement of African people in the Caribbean, the colonial regimes that fostered these crimes, and indeed the legacies of these crimes. And to do so within the context of Earl Lovelace's magnificent novel, SALT, which has been described in some places as the quintessential reparations novel of the world. And to reflect upon that moment in 2001, in which I was called upon to coordinate a vision for the Caribbean at the United Nations Conference in Durban, South Africa, a conference that was organized to mobilize international opinion around the issues of crimes against humanity, racism, the legacies of colonization, and all of the injustices that have followed. As part of my preparation for that conference in 2001, 20 years ago, I thought it necessary to revisit SALT, the consciousness and the narrative of Earl Lovelace, and to sharpen my comprehension of the issues that face the African people in the Caribbean in the decades that followed the Emancipation Act of 1833. I also found it necessary to revisit and to reread a novel that had been published 100 years earlier, and some would describe it as a literary political discourse. The book by Trinidadian J.J. Thomas, entitled Fraudacity, West Indian Fables Explained. J.J. Thomas's book was published in 1889. J.J. was, like Earl, a Trinidadian, an Afro-Trinidadian. He was a school teacher who was born within the immediate aftermath of emancipation and whose parents had been enslaved. So he had erupted intellectually from the sugar plantation of Trinidad to engage the emancipation movement and moment, and to opine on the narrative around emancipation as a development model. The connections, of course, between salt and fraudacity are pedagogical, intellectual, and thematic. When J.J. wrote Fraudacity, he was responding to the opinions of Professor Anthony Froude, who was professor of imperial history at Oxford, who had visited the West Indies and, having returned to England, published his book called The English in the West Indies, and that was published in 1888. Froude's book, The English in the West Indies, generated quite a stir and a robust debate in England, because what Froude essentially argued was that emancipation was a fundamental error in policy, and that the Emancipation Act was an injustice not only to the Africans, but it was a fundamental error in British colonial administration. That the black people did not need nor deserve emancipation, and since they had been emancipated, they had degenerated in every way imaginable. They had disconnected from the work ethic. They had morally degenerated into having no sense of self-responsibility. And they had retreated from the philosophies of the Western world. Emancipation then had taken the Black West Indians backward. And the evidence of this was to be seen everywhere. This is what generated the response by J.J. Thomas, and this is why he called his book Fraudacity. Arguably, I presume that Froude had the audacity to make these arguments, and that these were just racist, white supremacists, white supremacy concepts and propositions that had no bearing upon the reality in the Caribbean, and that the professor had presented an articulation of fables that needed to be explained. And who better to do this than an Afro-West Indian who had emerged from slavery and who had spent his time as a school teacher, very much like the character Alfred George in Lovelace's Salt. A school teacher focused on helping the emancipated community to comprehend and to understand what was actually going on around them and to mobilize politically for their true freedom as opposed to the fake emancipation. Lovelace's Salt goes precisely into the moments and the circumstances that J.J. Thomas had addressed. The quality of their thinking, the depths of their grasp of the social history, and their philosophical understanding of what slavery and emancipation were within the context of human liberty and the dignity of the human soul and spirit, and the significance of slavery and colonization for the sustainability of humanity were all captured by J.J. Thomas in 1889, in much the same way that Lovelace had done so 100 years later. They were both dealing with how West Indian society was taking shape. They were both trying to comprehend precisely in terms not only of living standards, but also in terms of the spirit of freedom, what the emancipation legislation had created, and how the British government had created a fraudulent piece of legislation and had hoped to get the public relations benefit of such an act, in which they wanted to propagate the notion that they were freeing the black people, while the evidence on the ground was showing that, on the contrary, they were tightening the grip upon the emancipated to further their subordination and to consolidate white supremacy as the organizing principle within Caribbean society. Importantly, the issue of freedom, not only as a lived experience, but as an imagined and felt experience, had to be interrogated. In SALT, we were asked to reflect upon the question: can African people live peacefully within the same kinds of societies in which white people had stolen, kidnapped African people in their millions, brought them to the Caribbean, extracted 200 years of free labor, having clapped them in chains in perpetuity, and having benefited financially and socially from 200 years of free labor? The question was asked in SALT as it was in Fraudacity. What was the expectation of African people in respect of reparatory justice and the need to build a viable, sustainable moral order within the context of that repairing? In SALT, we hear the language, the words, and Lovelace was very explicit on this question when he placed within the language of one of his characters that we have to repair the wrong by making reparations. That was a powerful arrow that flew through the pages of SALT, and we have to try to repair the wrong by making reparations. And hence, at the end of the novel, within the context of Bongo's march, where Bongo says that we have to march for reparations for all of us. That reparations is something that we must fight for. It must carry on. The march for reparations, we are told, must go on and on. And as Lovelace tells us in his closing paragraph, we have to go on and on And even if it takes us to the very end of time, we have to march for reparations. This is a language that has underpinned the fundamental principles and the philosophy of reparatory justice within the Caribbean context. Certainly, in Durban in 2001, there were two important observations that were made. One, that those of us at the turn of the 21st century were not creating a reparations movement. We were, in fact, a part of the 8th iteration of the reparations movement, because the moment enslaved Africans were brought into the Caribbean, the reparatory justice movement started and was expressed in so many ways. Even within the context of emancipation legislation, the enslaved were saying loud and clear, sending the message to the British Parliament, we are entitled to reparations for the extraction of labor against our will, the stealing of our labor capacity, and its usage by those who claim ownership of our persons. So within the debate in the British Parliament, and before the legislation got to the floor of the Parliament, the African voice was heard calling for reparations. The response of the British Parliament was that you, the black people, ought to be silent. You have no right to reparations. In fact, your legal freedom that we are about to legislate is your reparations. That is your reparations. There's nothing more you can expect or should expect. And thus, the dismissal of the reparatory claims of those who were about to emancipate. There was no generation that followed that emancipated generation that did not make reference to reparations all through the 19th century, all through the 20th century. And then here we were in Durban in 2001, standing against that long history of reparations claims. And thus we found in SALT an articulation of the foundation principles and philosophies of this Caribbean reparations movement. Of course, Lovelace discusses all of the various postures and positions that the many groups have taken on this question. Guinea John was able to fly away home in his mythical form back to Africa. This was his way of responding to emancipation. The time has come within a Pan-Africanist consciousness to fly away home to Africa. But those brothers and sisters of Guinea John who had consumed the salt and who had been burdened by the salt and who could not fly away to Africa had to stay in situ in Trinidad, in the Caribbean, and muddle through to their freedom. There was no flying away. There was digging in, taking ownership of land, of community, of self, reclaiming dignity, demanding justice, shifting from teaching and learning to political mobilization and political articulation. Alfred George, the teacher turned politician, engaging with his reality, looking for reparatory justice. And of course, the discursive positions were as alive then as they are now. Those who would argue, why do we want to blame the past for the future? It is time to move on from this dark history and take a fresh guard. On the other hand, there were those who say no, that there can be no justice without peace and reconciliation. There can be no future that is sustainable unless the damage of the past is repaired. The wrongs are made right by reparations. That those who commit those crimes must be held accountable. That the form of accountability can be varied, but accountability there must be. That those who committed the crimes must be brought back to the scene of the crime to participate in a dialogue of repair. And importantly, the system of white supremacy that emerged within the context of slavery had to be looked upon frontally and destroyed. That if there's going to be the dignity of the human being within the context of a democratizing order, then the white supremacy model had to be crushed and thrown into the ocean. All of these conversations we find clearly set out in SALT, capturing the reality that the emancipated generations throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century had to speak about. In the book by Anthony Froude, The English and the West Indies, he argued that without colonial direction, without colonial tutelage, without colonial administration, the black people in the Caribbean were doomed. They would return to their African savagery. They would return to their anti-development ways. They would return to a culture that would not produce economic growth. These were the arguments of Professor Froude out of Oxford, speaking to the emancipated generation. And because without white tutelage, the black people were doomed, without the Caribbean slave systems, the British economy would also suffer because the British economy needed to drink from the well of enslaved labor. This was the world to which J.J. Thomas stood his ground and described the narratives of Professor Froude as fables, fables to be explained. And when she showed that emancipation was producing the renaissance of African civilization, that the black people had emerged within the context of economic development. They were rebuilding their communities and their villages. They were participating in the domestic economy. They were participating in the export economy. And indeed, it was this competition that emerging black entrepreneurs were posing to the traditional hegemony of the white merchant and planter class. That was the basis of the racist backlash as represented by Professor Froude. The context of SALT remains. As black people have emerged to build out democracies, to push for economic enfranchisement, to demand a level playing field in respect of the structure of the economy, these are the issues that are now before the world in the context of Black Lives Matters. The relationship of the Afro-Caribbean people and the Indo-Caribbean people has to be seen within the context of the three scenes of the same play. The first scene being the destruction of the indigenous people, the second scene being the chattel enslavement of the African people, and the third scene of the act being the deceptive indentureship of the Asian people, primarily of India, Mr. Moon and his family. But what held them together was the white supremacy structure that said we must accumulate wealth, and we will do so if we have to destroy the indigenous people, if we have to enslave the Africans, if we have to indenture the Indians. We will extract our wealth from the Caribbean for the benefits of our nation and to sustain white supremacy as a global order. Building out the multiracial society, building up the narrative of Alfred George and Mr. Moon, all looking for a place in the world, an equal place in the Caribbean and Trinidad, not committed to the philosophies and principles of racism between the people of Africa and the people of Asia, but calling for a space of dignity where the human dignity can be demonstrated in its culture, community life, identity. Self-hate was recognized as a feature of the colonial legacy, to be confronted and exploded by the power of self-motivation and the imperative of the reparatory justice process. Salt, many have said, is the quintessential reparations novel. That might not have been the imagining of Earl Lovelace, but certainly he was consciously laying the foundation for it, providing the evidentiary base within his literary structures for the power to repair and to heal as a precondition for high quality human society. I will end with this. I did state in my plenary at Durban that the reparatory justice movement is going to be the greatest political movement of the 21st century. That all of these people, from the Caribbean to Africa, across the Americas, wherever African peoples have been enchained and enslaved and stripped of their social dignity, that reparatory justice was going to arise. But critically also, that all of the peoples of the world who have been colonized by the white supremacy structures of Europe, whether they were Africans or Asians, the indigenous peoples, these people are going to be demanding justice for these crimes. And there is going to be the interconnection of the people of Africa and Asia and Oceania around the issue of reparatory justice, calling for global healing. And the combination of all of these contexts would create the greatest political movement of the 21st century. And this is precisely what we are seeing today all over the globe. This is precisely what the world is showing. And this is why Lovelace, as the prophet of the moment and the movement, was able to say that Bango's march, the march to repair, the march for reparations, is a march for all of us. For all of us. And we cannot agree more. We cannot agree more with the words of the prophet. When at the end of his literary narrative, Lovelace tells us that this march for reparatory justice must go on, and it must go on, even if, as he says, it takes us all to the very end of time. It must go on. This is the vision assault. This was the vision of J.J. Thomas in 1889 when he exploded the mythologies, the fables of Anthony Froude, the English professor, in 1888. And this is where we are in the journey that started before J.J. Thomas, through to him, through to Earl Lovelace. This is the journey we are on, and we will persist if it takes us to the very end of time. Thank you.
Greetings, my name is Wendell Manwarren, and it's my absolute pleasure to share this reading with you from Earl Lovelace's Salt. I remember the first time that I read it, it absolutely blew my mind, so I just think it's well worth sharing. So thanks for the opportunity. I looked to see what kind of danger Uncle Bango brought with him into our front yard on those Saturdays. But there was nothing I could identify as threatening, and I knew of no possession of his or of any previous differences between either my mother and him or him and my father. No family quarrel. All that I could see separating him from my other uncles was this story that he was ever willing to tell. So it had to be his story. Watch the landscape of this island, he began with the self-assured conviction that my mother couldn't stand in him. And you know that they could have never hold people here surrendered to unfreedom. The sky, the sea, every green leaf and tangle of vines sing freedom. Birds frisk and flitter and whistle and sing, just so a yardcock will drop his chest and crow. Things here have their own mind. The rain decide when it's going to fall. Sometimes in the middle of the day, the sky clear. You hear a rushing, swooping sound, and whoops, it fall down. Other times, it set up whole day, and then you're sure that now, yes, it's going to fall. It just clear away. It had no brooding, inscrutable wilderness here. There was no wild and passionate uproar to make people feel there is beast, to stir this great evil wickedness in their blood, to make them want to go out and murder people. Maybe that madness seized Columbus and the first set of conquerors when they land here and wanted the Carib people to believe that they was gods. But afterwards, after they settle the island and decide that, yes, it's here we're going to live now, they begin to discover how hard it was to be gods. The heat, the diseases, the weight of armor they had to carry in the hot sun, the imperial poses they had to strike, the powdered wigs to wear, the churches to build, the heathens to baptize, the illiterate to educate, the animals to tame, the numerous species of plants to name, histories to write, flags to plant, parades to make, the militia to assemble, letters to write home. And all around them, this rousing greenness bursting in the wet season, and another quieter shade of perspiring in the dry. On top of that, they had to put up with the noise from black people. Whole night, black people have their drums going as they dance in the bush. All those dances, all those lascivious bodies leaping and bending down. They couldn't see them in the dark among the shadows and trees, but they could hear. They had to listen to them dance the bambula, bambula, the quilbe, the manding, the juba, the ibo, the pique, the haliko, the koromanti, the congo, the shifo, the banda, the penko, the chirrup, the kalinda, the bongo. It was hard for white people. It had days they wanted to just sit down under a breadfruit tree and cool off, to reach up and pick a ripe mango off the tree and eat it. It had times they just wanted to jump into the sea and take a sea bath, to romp with a girl on a bed of dead leaves underneath the umbrella of cocoa trees. They try, but they had it hard. They walk a little distance, and then they had to stop. Perspiration soaking them, sticking their clothes to their bodies. It was so hot, they had to get these big, roomy cork hats to wear to keep their brains cool. They had to get people to fan them, people to carry their swords, people to carry cushion for them to sit down on. They had to get people to beat people for them, people to dish out lashes, 75, 35, 85. But what else to do? People had to get licks to keep them in line. How else they could have carried on the work? feeding all those people, giving them rations, putting clothes on their backs. And it was hard. It was very hard to mold the Negro character, to stamp out his savage tendencies. They tried to make provisions for allowing his innocent amusements after Mass and until evening prayers, to see that they didn't cohabit without benefit of matrimony, to lay out the work for him to do, to pass around later to see that he do it. No, really, they try. They reduced the number of lashes to 25. They tried in administering the floggings to make sure and not to cause the effusion of blood or contusions. But what else to do? There was no natural subservience here. Nobody didn't bow down to nobody just so. To get a man to follow your instructions, you had to pen him and beat him and cut off his ears or his foot when he ran away. You had was to take away his woman from him and his child. And still, that fellow stand up and oppose you. But these fellas here, these fellas was the most lawless and rebellious set of fellas they had in the Caribbean. The majority of them dangerous rebels exiled from the other islands. Men that had no cure. Fellas whose sport was to bust one another head. Fellas who make up their mind to dead. Who land on the wharf from Martinique and Grenada and St. Lucia, and wherever they bring them, singing, Muma, Muma, your son in the grave already, your son in the grave already, take a towel and burn your belly, singing, 1,000, 1,000, 10,000, taba, me one, singing, when I dead, bury me clothes, I don't want no sweet man to wear me clothes. And it wasn't just man alone. It had woman there, was even more terrible. They had to ban them from talking. They had to ban them from walking and from raising up their dress tail and shaking their melodious backsides. That wasn't easy. The plantation people couldn't handle them. They beat them. They hold them down. They turn them over and do them whatever wickedness they could manage. But they couldn't break them. And then it dawned on them that you can't defeat people. Then they find out that people too stupid to be defeated. They're too hardened. They don't learn what you try to teach them. They don't hear you. They forget. You tell a man to do something, and he tell you, he forget. You tell him to shoot, and he forget to load the rifle. You tell him to get up at 5 and 9 o'clock, he now yawning and stretching. He didn't hear you, or he hears something different to what you tell him. You is the expert. But he believed that he know better than you what it is you want him to do. And he do it, and he mess it up. 400 years it take them to find out that you can't keep people in captivity. 400 years. And it didn't happen just so. People had to revolt. People had to poison people. Port of Spain had to burn down. A hurricane had to hit the island. Haiti had to defeat Napoleon. People had to run away up the mountain. People had to fight. And then they agree, yes, we can't hold people in captivity here. But now, they had another problem. It was not how to keep people in captivity. It was how to set people at liberty.
Thank you, Wendell Manwarren, for that reading. And I also want to thank Professor Sir Hilary Beckles for joining us here at the Black Consciousness Festival and for giving us that riveting address where he situated salt for us in our context. And he also reminded us that the journey has to continue, the journey to reparatory justice. We go on and on and on. So at the end of it, there's a space for all of us. Thank you, Professor. Appreciated. Our next conversation comes up at 1, so we'll see you then. Thank you.